So the sad truth is, I think I may have sold myself a bit short calling my drum plugin Ultimate Heavy Drums and being so focused on metal. Admittedly, I'm a metal guy, but I think it's one of the most versatile drum libraries out there, and a lot of these sounds translate to pop, rock, alt mixes as well as metal. And although my focus when capturing these sounds in the studio and processing them was a metal mix, you'll see how easily they translate into the world of modern pop rock and that kind of stuff. Because great drum sounds in the world of modern rock and pop punk and that kind of stuff, they share commonalities with metal, and that's usually a really good hard smacking rim shot snare sound with a balanced high end and low end cutting through the mix, and a really stable, consistent kick drum. The only real difference usually is where the high end is placed on the kick and how much high end there is when it comes to the difference between a pop rock mix and a metal mix. So if you were to take the drum sound from Paramore's Misery Business and you just add those drums and you put on a bunch of metal riffs, super gnarly metal tone, screaming vocals, no one would bat an eyelid at the drum sound being out of place. It's a really metal sounding drum sound. So a lot of these pop punk, alt rock mixes that people rave about in that world, usually stuff mixed by CLA or David Bendith, a lot of those mixes share so many commonalities with metal mixes, and this may be a debatable statement, but one of my favorite producers, Andy Sneap, said if you can mix metal, then you can mix any genre, because with metal you've got a wall of super loud guitars occupying the entire frequency range. More so than ever, bass is now fighting for all those same frequencies and a bit more low end. You've got fast drums, you still want the drums to feel impactful and heavy as well, going at speed. So all of that stuff is really hard to mix. So in the past when I've mixed and produced some like pop punk bands or alt rock, it is like a breath of fresh air. It's so easy compared to what I'm used to doing to create the space and get a really heavy mix, because I'm so used to having everything competing for the same frequencies. So as I said earlier, one of the main things that's going to differentiate a metal mix with like a pop punk or alt rock mix is just the high end on the kick drum. You'll often hear a lot of these kind of rock guys talking about mixing and saying if you want a more metal sound, just crank like 8K or something and get more high end in there. And although that is true, there's a difference between the EQ moves that you're going to make versus where the peak of your high end is actually going to come through. Particularly if you're working with real drums and just a raw kick sample, certain microphones, if you just crank up 8K, although that's where you're bringing up, you're still going to be bringing up other high end with it, and the peak of your high end is probably still going to be more towards like 4K. And I'll show you what I mean now looking at some raw kick sounds. So let's check out this raw kick sound. There's a D112 microphone. We're going to use the frequency analyzer of this EQ just to look at what we're doing. Now typically a lot of people like to use SSL style EQ, or people like CLA will use, an actual desk to do this kind of thing. So let's look at, we're going to boost 8K and we're going to crank it up. We're going to see what it actually does to this kick sound. So I'm boosting 8K by 15 dB, but it doesn't mean that 8K is what's cutting through the mix. As you can see, the peak of the high end from this kick drum is actually coming through just below 3K. Now let's look at a 91. Now admittedly these are going to be a lot brighter sounding, so maybe if we absolutely crank 8K just on this mic, we might see a bit more of a peak around that area. Now even then, the peak of the high end is coming through more like 6K. Once you blend these mics and you get your kick sounding right in the mix, it's actually going to sound better cutting through more like 4K in terms of where the peak of your high end is coming through. I'm just going to show you one of my favorite kick drum sounds from Arch Enemy's Anthems of Rebellion. The way this kick cuts through the mix sounds so pleasing to me, the way it cuts through the guitars. If we look at it, the high end focus is around 4K. There's not really a lot going on above like 6K, and it's quite a steep drop off there. So just assuming that metal kick drums have a ton of high end like above 6K isn't always the case. Pantera definitely do have quite a bit more like sort of 6K focus, but for me a lot of that kind of attack that cuts through in a pleasing way is more similar to what cuts through in most rock mixes as well. So kick drums in pop punk and rock music don't need to cut through the mix quite the same way as metal stuff when there's a lot of fast double pedal. Obviously there are some exceptions, like some of that Blink-182 stuff is really fast and they have a bit more of a clicky kick drum to cut through the mix on the fast stuff they do. But typically speaking, most pop punk and rock mixes just don't have quite as much high end, or it's not focused in quite the same place as a lot of metal stuff. And another commonality with all these pop punk and rock mixes that people like is usually the use of samples. People like CLA use samples for their kicks, snares and toms, sometimes probably fully replacing the kick drum sample just to get a really consistent low end and just consistency and punch to the kick sound. And from what I've heard, David Bendeth used about 12 different snare samples stacked on top of each other to create that Paramore drum sound. So let's check out some examples where I've tried to recreate some famous pop punk and rock mixes using sounds that were created for a metal mix. Okay, so I'm going to show you this quick demo of American Idiot that I recreated. I think it sounds pretty authentic, not too far from the original. And this one is a preset that comes just as standard with the kit in the factory presets, and this one is called the Green Punk Kit. So exactly what you hear now is just a preset that comes with Ultimate Heavy Drums. Sounds like this. And again, the beauty of having two separate kick drums that can be treated differently in the plugin means you can program the regular kicks like this and have a more close mic sound, and then for those roomy kick drums, switch to the left one and then increase the room mic and increase the sustain on the Transient Designer on that one to have that kind of automated difference in sounds. I'm using just some plugins for the amps. Weirdly, that amp, no one would really assume I'd be using a Triple X to do a Green Day song, but I just kind of went with what I had. So let's check out the drums. So believe it or not, the kick drum I'm using here is the exact same kick that I used for the Pantera mix recreation. But I'm just tilting the EQ more towards the low end. And I'm also bringing in a bit more of the overhead microphone, not a lot, which is going to add a bit more of a dull attack. If I was to leave the kick drum, the tilt EQ, which is on this channel here, the close mic kick, center, it would sound a bit more metal. But even within context, it's not too like splatty or high-end metallic sounding. So all I did was tilt the EQ to the left and just emphasize the low end a bit more and take your ear away from that brightness. And I'll show you what the overhead mic sounds like. And the snare drum is the default snare from this, which is the bell brass in the mid tuning. Sounds like that. And that's, I'd say it's mid. It's maybe a little bit higher than what most people would consider a mid tuning. But it cuts through in a very similar way. Really consistent sound. Obviously it's programmed. But also there is a one-shot sample blended in at the highest layers for that snare. And then just for this section, just crank the room mics and the toms. So yeah, nothing too crazy going on with that mix. That is quite a metallic kick drum sound. But all I've done is really just tilt the EQ a bit more towards the low end. So there's just a bit more low end than there is high end, and it doesn't cut through in quite the same metallic way. So I've loaded up this Jimmy Eat World mix recreation. I've heard this album a lot when I was a kid. Like, my friend just used to listen to it all the time, and I always really liked the drum sound on it, or the mix in general sounds pretty cool. Definitely a lot less bright than the Green Day or Paramore stuff, but still really satisfying and also quite aggressive sounding as well. And again, this one is a preset. It comes with the factory resets. It's called Jim's World of Alt Rock, and this is exactly how it sounds out of the box. I'm using the Guru kick drum, which definitely has a bit more of a rock sound to it on the close mic if I just solo that. But I'm actually relying a lot more on the overhead microphone, which is again supplying more of that kind of dull attack. And because it was recorded in, quite a lively room, you can hear a bit of room ambience coming through there as well. And tilting the EQ a little bit to the left to remove a little bit of the high end or put more emphasis on the low end, but not by much. And out of all the kick drums in this sample library, that one is probably the more kind of rock sounding one. And there's an alternate mix there, which is a bit more of like a more modern kind of Zach Savini style kick sound, which I used on like the Parkway Drive Mix Recreation. Then the snare drum, we're using this Ludwig 402, the mid-tuning one, and it sounds like this. And again, a bit more of the overhead mic just to bring in a less processed sort of sound, and a good amount of the room in there, just a little boost on that. And actually brightening this one up, and this is how it sounds. And this one is in the style of Paramore. Change the song slightly, not going to get into why, but this is how this one sounds. So again, I think I'm using that Guru kick drum for this one. Yep, which is a bit more rock sounding. Again, just taking a little of the high end off the top of it. I've actually got a one-shot sample blended in, and this is from the library. It is the Tama resonant head off 22-inch kick sound, which would sound like this, which has a good amount of like pleasing low end to it. So I've blended that in with it. And because David Bendeth used a ton of different snare sounds stacked on top of each other, from the instrument itself we're using the Ludwig 402, but I've also got this Gretsch one-shot sample, which is also comes with the pack blended in. And that one's a bit more like trashy sounding. I've got a lot more sustain cranked on this one and a bit less attack. And that helps when you're stacking up snares not to have too much transient coming through, and they kind of blend well together. And let's listen to the drums in isolation. And you can hear it sounds quite machine gunny there when you've got a one-shot sample blended in, but that is how the actual record sounds. You can hear that there's a ton of samples on that snare drum, and a lot of those rolls sound like machine guns on the record. And again, I haven't looked at this, but you can go into the overhead cymbal mixer here. You can make the cymbals a little less bright. It's quite common for more kind of rock mixes to have kind of more dull overheads and leave as much high end in the mix for the vocals to cut through. Whereas in metal, you can have, you know, brighter, more kind of cutting cymbal sounds that sound a bit more abrasive, and it kind of adds to the heaviness. So I could cycle through some different sounds with this one. I'll take off the one shot, or just turn it down in the mix, and show you some of these different kick and snare sounds in the mix that are, again, typically metal sounding samples, but how they're going to work in a non-metal context. So basically just cycling through any of them and just tilting the EQ so there's a bit more low end coming through, less focus on the high end, and these very metal sounding kick drum samples just instantly just sit really well in a rock mix. So let's cycle through some different snares. Now snares, particularly in this kind of Paramore style mix, a super metal sounding snare drum is still going to work, because to me the Paramore snare drum sounds really metal. It's quite a deep sounding snare, but it still holds up pretty well in that kind of mix. Okay, so this is the Shove It kit preset. This is the Deftones Around the Fur, or My Own Summer preset. Obviously, there's some different drum sounds on that record if you listen closely. And this is how this preset sounds. So again, we've got a bit of the overhead mic in there. I'm using that Guru kick drum and taking a lot of the high end off, or leaning more towards the low end. And then doing some interesting stuff with the envelope filters here to kind of do some gating, using a lot more of the overhead snare mic and not much room. It's quite a dry sound, and that's why I'm even using that envelope filter on like the overhead mic, because you can hear a bit of the room in the overhead. And there's not a ton of sustain on it, so I'm actually killing a bit of sustain and release on the close mic or process sound. So this is how they sound in solo. So with the envelope filter, I'm kind of emulating quite a harsh kind of gated sound on the snare. Then we can check out this Bring Me the Horizon one. This is another preset from Ultimate Heavy Drums. This is the Can You Feel My Snare factory preset, which is number 22, and it sounds like this. Particularly happy with how fat these toms sounds. I think these are the Q drums toms. So this one, we're using the Ludwig super low snare. Sounds like that. And then we're actually using the Timer 22 resonant head off kick. Again, just taking some of the high end off, or leaning more towards the low end for that one. And then using quite a lot of the overhead snare mic, but making it a bit more dull sounding, a bit more thuddy, and it sounds like that. So to summarize, a great sounding snare drum, if it's well balanced and got a good hard hit, will work across any genre. It kind of just depends on if you want like a lower tuned snare, something with a bit more ring, a bit more high pitched, whatever it is. If you're looking for drum sounds and you're in the metal world, don't just limit yourself to looking at sample packs that are just specifically for metal. And if you do pop rock, pop punk, alt rock kind of stuff, don't just think that metal drums are going to be too aggressive for you, or too metallic for your mixes. It's just a case of balancing the amount of high end, and you can do that quite easily and quite subtly to make a huge difference in the context of your mix. When it comes to kick drums, again, it's just really just a matter of how much high end you've got. And again, if you find kick drums that you like, typically for me, I find most people's idea of a metal kick drum is too much high end above 6K, and most of these companies putting out metal kits don't really maybe necessarily listen to a lot of metal. All of my favourite kick drums in the world of metal, the high end is definitely focused towards more of a rock sound. That kind of attack sits really well in a metal mix, and it doesn't get too high up above like 6K with the attack, and it cuts through and sits with the guitars nicely. So I think there's a lot of similarities between metal drums and pop rock, alt rock mixes. It's pretty much just some subtle balancing. And if you want to check out like the Pantera drum mix I did, or like the Deftones one, I'll link them below.